I'm the Center Square State Government reporter Carleen Johnson. Along with me today, our Eastern Washington reporter Tim Clouser, who has been diving along with members of the council this week into Spokane's budget. Apparently, we didn't do too bad in 2025. Looking ahead, are we in for more taxes later this year and certainly into the next biennium budget for 27 and 28? Because apparently, we're already looking at some deficits. So, Tim, unpack this for us. What do the latest numbers show for 2025 and then looking ahead for the rest of this year and into the coming following couple of years?
Yeah, so from the time Mayor Lisa Brown took office in early 2024, she knew that she was walking into a tough budget situation that she mainly blamed on the prior administration's budgeting practices. But looking going into 2025, they were focused on balancing a $25 million deficit. They did that going into 2025. Then into 2026, they had another $13 million deficit. But budgets are kind of a living, breathing document. So going back to 2025, we just wrapped that up a few months ago, but the city hasn't finalized its books yet, much like the rest of the state. So they're not sure quite how the numbers are going to end, but they said that early in 2025, they noticed that sales tax growth was the most volatile that it's ever been for 2025 compared to prior years. So usually when they look at sales tax growth, which is where much of their revenue comes from, you see like constant gains. So usually they would say, we're going to look at 2, 3, 4% annually. And that's sat pretty consistent. They said with 2025, it was pretty alarming because in some months you would see that 2 or 3% increase in sales tax growth, but then in other months it would plummet and be negative. So it made it hard to plan ahead. And in response, the city kind of pulled back on spending. So that kept them within their means. They're saying by the time they finalize the 2025 books, they do expect maybe a slight surplus. And I'm saying slight, very slight. But if not a slight surplus, they expect the books to come out balanced. But at the same time, with the books being balanced, they still looking ahead to 2026 before we entered this year. They knew there was a $13 million deficit because of rising costs, expanding spending, and they balanced that by making cuts, passing a new parking tax and such. But it doesn't solve their problems going forward. Every year with inflation rising, it's going to tighten their belts. So right now, inflation on average rises about 3% annually. Last year, they ended up with sales tax growth year over year at about 0.7%. They had budgeted 2%. So that sales tax revenue is coming in far below inflation. So really, they're just not getting as much bang for their buck. And what does that do for the future? It likely means that they're going to end in another budget deficit ahead of next year that they'll have to solve going into the 2027 to 2028 biennium.
And you mentioned them kind of realizing, early into 2025, the sales tax revenue wasn't coming in what they expected. Maybe it's because people are so heavily taxed. We just don't have income to go make those high dollar purchases on many items. But they reined in spending for different city agencies, county agencies, maybe didn't take as many trips or that kind of a thing. What did they do to sort of rein in government spending? Because as you and I well know, and you've written about this extensively, that is so much of a huge cost of government is the employees and their benefits.
Mhm. Yeah, you're right. They did pull back discretional spending. They didn't go into too much detail during the budget meeting on Thursday, but they did pull back discretionary spending, and I'm sure that wherever there was vacancies, they likely eliminated those or held off on filling those because, it's been said in Spokane and a lot of other cities around the state, generally with salaries and benefits, it makes up about 80% of the budget. So it's easy to say, "Hey, let's go in let's cut these things, let's cut spending on this," but really it comes down to headcount. So they said that they did pull back on spending to stay within their means, but that just balanced things for the time being. You have these collective bargaining agreements, which is the union negotiations for these people saying that, year over year, you're going to get X amount of raise, 2, 3%, however much it's set at. But the city is obligated to give those raises. So next year, you're going to see those salaries increase, and that's going to increase the city's spending. And they have to come up with a way to pay those wages, or they have to get rid of, say, non exempt employees. So it's likely we're facing another deficit ahead of 2027. Last July, they had given budget projections showing that there could be somewhat of a $20 million deficit in 2027, and then a $25 to $30 million deficit in 2028. And they're on a biennium budget, a 2-year budget, so that would be a cumulative budget of $50 million or so. And I asked the city council about this. Council member Michael Cathcart, he's the only conservative left on the dais. He said they don't have a firm projection yet. They are looking at getting that 6-year general fund forecast out by July, a little bit later than they were expecting. They were hoping by May. It doesn't look like that's going to happen. But he said from conversations that he's had with the council's budget director, they are looking at somewhat of a $20 million deficit ahead of next year. And in the past, they have made cuts, but they have also turned to taxes the last 2 years to help fill that budget deficit. And with him only being a one-person minority on the council, he doesn't have much room to push back, and said there are options for them to raise taxes, whether it be on the ballot or councilmanically for next year. But he's hoping in that they just tighten their belts and batten down. And his suggestion was, instead of saying, let's budget for 2% sales tax growth, or even lower than that, why not budget 0%? Say our
Well,
revenues
never
are not
gonna
going
get
to grow at
nothing, then
all.
be happy and spend more if you get more than you thought you were gonna get.
Yeah, yeah.
It's kinda like how you and I have to budget, right? I mean, it's nice as, city, county employees that they can literally bank on that, cost of living increase every year because they are public employees. Of course, it doesn't work that way in the private sector. If things aren't going well for private companies, nobody's getting a raise, but in government, it never works that way. I mean, Tim, I know you didn't get into it this much in the article up at the Center Square Washington's page on the budgeting this week on that, but I was wondering if you have any sense, just anecdotally from your previous coverage, the homeless situation in Spokane. It's been something you've written extensively about, and I wonder how much of a drain on city and county resources might play into that. Um, Maybe not any discussion in this budget on Thursday, but that's gotta be a continued strain on the budget.
Yeah, yeah, and just to clarify, this is just the city's budget. The county has faced
Okay.
its own budget woes, but we're talking about the city here. And yeah, homelessness in mitigating that crisis, it does play an impact on the budget. But I will say at the same time, uh, in they spend tens of millions of dollars on homelessness every year in Spokane, but much of that comes from the state and federal government grants from them. And that's not to say that that's not our tax dollars. That's tax dollars that we're paying,
Right.
but it's not so much the local taxes that Spokane is raising. They're not say, raising taxes to cover these homelessness expenses. Although one could argue that, say, the public safety sales tax does go towards mitigating homelessness in a sense. But they do spend a few $1 million on it. I wouldn't say it's such a substantial amount of their budget that it's pulling them down. But I think the situation in Spokane is that there's not quite an appetite to batten down and make the real difficult decisions. When it comes down to balancing a budget, if you want to say, let's cap our revenues where they're at and live within our means, there's inevitable consequences that come with that, and that usually means cutting headcount, and that can be a difficult thing to do and unpopular on both sides of the aisle. If you come and say you fire 20 people, that's 20 people who aren't taking a check home to feed their families. But that's not to say that the city shouldn't be living within their means. They have to get to a point where they have to say, well, are we going to increase taxes substantially, or are we going to cut substantially? And going into 2025, when they were facing that $20 million deficit, they put this sales tax measure on the ballot that gave them about $7 million, and it kind of delayed some of those more consequential cuts that they would have to make. But prior to putting that, the mayor had proposed this massive property tax increase that she said would solve the city's $25 million deficit on its own. But at the same time, it would raise the cost of living substantially for property owners. And when she proposed this, she basically said, look, if you guys don't pass this, our budget's going to stay in this unsustainable position, and we might have to fire dozens of police officers.
Of
And
course,
so
they
it's kind
immediately
of a big trade off there.
they go immediately to the public safety thing, even though that's supposed to be outside of education, priority number one. That's always the, if you don't let us raise taxes, we have to fire all the cops. I mean, that is just such an old and tiresome
Yeah.
argument. And that's, and of course that makes people freak out and they go, okay, sure, raise my taxes. I don't want to lose, my officer. It's
That's what whether it be police officers or city council staffers, it inevitably comes back down to headcount, though. So I think that's likely an argument that we'll see heading into budget negotiations later this year is the council willing to make some of those bigger cuts to, say, staffing across the city, or are they more so willing to delay the more consequential cuts that they'll have to make down the road if they don't make them this year?
mm. And I think if you ask the average Spokane taxpayer, and maybe took a big poll of people and said, okay, are you willing to, you know, cut back a little on city staff versus lose a couple of police officers, you're probably going to get folks that want to support the police and maybe forgo a couple of city staffers. But
Yeah, and I will step in right here. So the Greater Spokane Incorporated, it's essentially the regional chamber of commerce for Spokane. It does these, I think it's a quarterly poll that it does to taxpayers, looking at, do you feel safe going downtown during the day and at night? What's working with the city? What's not working with the city? Do you prefer living in unincorporated county in the city or in Spokane Valley? And one of the questions that they asked last fall was, do you think that the city is making enough in terms of tax dollars? And do you think that they're spending it efficiently? And the majority of people in the survey last fall said, yes, we do think that the city is making more than enough in terms of taxes, and they are not spending it efficiently. So it's a clear sign from the taxpayers that uh, they're not really happy with the rising cost of living over the last few years, and they would like the council to do more in terms of spending that money efficiently and making sure it goes farther and that they get the bang for their buck.
well, that's exactly it. We're all paying more and more and more in taxes, and yet, quality of life, cost of living, uh, ability to feel safe, as you mentioned, going downtown to the local grocery store, we see that we're not getting the bang for the buck. So I think that's interesting that finding in Spokane, well, second largest city in the whole state, massive population there. So thank you for paying attention to it and staying on top of it. And if you want to check out Tim's story, I encourage you to go to thecentersquare.com/Washington. And thank you for joining us today, Tim. Appreciate all your work on this important topic. Thanks for watching this episode of Washington in Focus.